your talks, and my team, we are going to talk about and give a few presentations. This is the first one. This is mainly on technology. My background is irrigation and biosystems engineering, so I enjoy new tools and playing with sensors and data to kind of monitor everything and quantify everything. So let me use this laser phone. So the first talk, this talk is on smart irrigation controllers. So if you're not familiar with the smart controllers, hopefully this gives you some ideas in terms of the fundamentals of smart controllers, how they operate, how they work, and then how they can actually help us save water. So this is these are the components of a typical irrigation system. By typical irrigation system, I mean the system, underground irrigation system that has a timer. So we have an irrigation supply line, of course, that is coming, that bringing municipal water source. Usually there might be a backflow prevention device, especially for larger public areas to prevent water to go back. And then there are, of course, irrigation pipes to deliver waters, and solenoid or electric valves. So these are the valves that we can electronically and remotely control them to be open and closed. And there are sprinklers, the irrigation system itself. There might be sprinklers or micro irrigation drapes, bubblers. So there are so many different types of devices out there to actually irrigate the lawn. And also a timer. Typically, there is a timer that you use the timer to program irrigation or schedule irrigation. So what the timer does basically sends a signal to these valves. The valves will be open and then the irrigation will occur. So the main questions that we need to answer in terms of to have a efficient irrigation is basically there are three questions: how much we want to irrigate, when we want to do the irrigation, and then of course, when we have a lawn with different hydro zones and different plants, you want to also know where to irrigate. And these are the questions. Actually, I started working on agricultural water management. We still do a lot of agricultural work. When I started my work in California 6 years ago, I got to the landscape irrigation work, and we have been working on this topic ever since. But these are the same questions that when we talk to growers and farmers, we actually want to answer them. The only difference is that when we want to stress the crops and save water, it's a little bit more tricky for agricultural crops because that reduces the yield and the crop production. But for landscape, it's we have more flexibility usually. So what happens? That is the main, I would say, source of waste of water for these typical systems with timers is that usually people set them and they forget to change them, or if so the irrigation applications usually might be high after rainfall or when the irrigation should be adjusted because of the lower evapotranspiration rate. So the strategy of set it and forget it, of course, wouldn't work. And this is a nice cartoon actually showing what's going to happen if you do over irrigate. And this, I live in Anaheim Hills, so I see over irrigation almost every single day when I go out to walk my dog. So the smart controllers, they have been around for a number of years, and they are more affordable now, more robust. They are basically a timer with a brain. That's how I usually think about them. So they still send signals to valves, they open them, but there is a sensor that regulates the irrigation and if programmed properly, helps save water. So, and then if you look at all of the devices that are out there, you can put them in two different categories, basically. Either they are weather-based controllers or soil moisture-based controllers. Soil moisture sensor-based controllers. I'm going to talk about each of these in this presentation. So how does a weather-based controller work? So when we say weather, of course, we are talking about the main concept is evapotranspiration. So evapotranspiration is a combination of, you probably are familiar with. So with this, if you talk about people who work on irrigation, they use this term a lot. A combination of evaporation from soil surface and transpiration by plants. It's difficult to measure these components separately. Usually that we use the combined term evapotranspiration. And another term that you should be familiar with is a term that is called reference evapotranspiration, which is basically evapotranspiration from a standardized surface that is cool season turf grass. So, and usually measuring evapotranspiration is really challenging, measuring it directly, just to exactly know how much water is used by plants and got evaporated. So that is why we usually estimate evapotranspiration, and the most widely used method is to use weather stations, and we have plenty of them. And I'm going to talk about CIMES stations in this presentation. So weather stations collect all the parameters that impact evapotranspiration, such as air temperature, wind speed, solar radiation, and then there are models that use, or equations that use those parameters to actually estimate evapotranspiration. And that estimation is for, again, cool season, turf grass that is not stressed, and that's worldwide. So everybody in this research community, they know that that's reference evapotranspiration. It could be alfalfa, but mainly turf grass. And when we talk about evapotranspiration-based irrigation scheduling, we actually should know what fraction of that reference evapotranspiration should be applied to each plant. I'm going to talk about that in more detail, but let's first take a look at CIMES. If you are not familiar with CIMES, this also has been around since mid-80s, or maybe some stations even before that. This is a great asset for us in California. When I go to talk to my colleagues in conferences, I usually brag about CIMES because this is not something that you see in all the states. So we are talking about, I don't know, 100, 200, I don't know how many stations, but so many stations that are working properly across the state, and the data is free to access. They give us that reference evapotranspiration daily and also hourly. So you can go there. If you want to get long-term data, you should create an account. But if you don't have an account, you can just go and get data, I think, for up to 2 weeks. So this is the main page. You go there, you click on this data tab, and then you need to find the nearest weather stations to their place that you live. So for us in Riverside is UC Riverside, which is the station number 44, which is basically located adjacent to my research plots. If you do that, then you can actually change if you want to get daily data or hourly, and then if you want to do metric or English unit. The default is hourly report with English unit. So you click run report, and then you get a table like this. So many numbers. You basically, unless you are really interested in seeing all the parameter changes, the only column that I look at it is the first one, ETO, or reference evapotranspiration. And then the second one, precipitation, if you get any rainfall. So the other parameters are the parameters that behind the scenes CIMES uses to actually calculate that reference evapotranspiration. So you can just look at the fluctuations. Of course, overnight, if you don't have any evapotranspiration, then you can see that it starts increasing, and then the highest is around solar noon. And the total is, for this day in 2017 in August, is 0.23 inches. How would you then use reference evapotranspiration data? I think you can do so many simple calculations that are beneficial for people who don't want to really maybe install smart controllers, but still want to do an educated guess, or they want to know exactly how much water they should apply. So this is just a simple example. This is a week worth of data evapotranspiration from CIMES, and you can see that the total evapotranspiration was reference evapotranspiration was 1.72 inches. And let's assume that we are going to apply this amount of water to our plant, and then we have a plant that uses all that water. So if we want to irrigate only 3 days a week, then we can divide this by 3. So each day we are going to irrigate 0.58 inches of water. And then let's assume that we have pop-up sprinkler heads that irrigates at a rate of 1 to 1.5 inches per hour. So if you do a simple math, if I run my system, it's going to put 1 inches of water per hour. So I'm just going to do put 0.5 inches of irrigation. So I only need to run my system 30 minutes. 30 minutes, 3 days days in a week, and then I put 1.72. So that again gives some ideas. If people are running 2 hours, their irrigation system is just too much. If they are running 10 minutes for this scenario, it's just too little. And then if you have a ground cover, don't talk about ground covers, that needs only 50% of this, we only need to run the irrigation systems 17 minutes for this scenario, 17 minutes, 3 days a week to fulfill the irrigation requirements based on the data. So it gives a lot of good information, and I usually I really recommend people to go and explore this website. So another concept that is important for irrigation management and scheduling is a concept of soil water balance. When we do calculate irrigation application and we assume that the water is being uptaken by plants, and that's when the soil water balance concept comes into play. That root zone is the place that we want the water to be stored so a crop can uptake it. But there are so many things that they can go wrong. If you over-irrigate, then we have runoff, and also we may have deep percolation. So those are the components that basically are not part of the beneficial water use. And also, I hear some background noise. I appreciate if everybody could unmute.
I think you're the only one unmuted, but I'll double check, okay?
Oh, thank you. Where were we? So, yeah, so this soil water balance is important. What we want to do in terms of efficient irrigation management and scheduling is to, when we apply water, we want to make sure that the water is available to plants. So we don't want to see waste of water. Another way to think about it is it's like a bank account. So basically irrigation, and then in rainy season, rainfall would be the deposit, the money deposit, and then withdrawal would be all the water that is being used by the plant. So there should be a balance between that. You don't want to really have no deposit when there is need for withdrawal. So let's talk about the weather-based irrigation controllers and wrap that up, and then we switch to the soil moisture-based controllers. So the weather-based controllers, they come in three types. So they either use historical ET data, which I don't think is the best way. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it doesn't really capture year-to-year variability. The second type is that they come with on-site weather sensors, and that's the type that we usually use, and we saw over and over in our research projects that they are good, at least the type that we use. And I'm going to talk about that in more details in later slides. They usually come with a rain sensor and also a small weather sensor that usually just only measures temperature, but uses a simple model to calculate reference evapotranspiration. There are also some newer controllers that they pull data from public weather stations. Those are also good, but if your house, your property, or is far from those weather stations, then those weather stations may not really capture or represent the local conditions. So that is why I personally prefer number 2, the controllers that come with a sensor that you install in your front yard or backyard. So what is happening behind the scene is that the controller is going to estimate reference evapotranspiration for you using that sensor. Then you need to program the controller and say, okay, for example, for this bulk feed, I only want to apply 20% of that. For the, ice plant, I want to apply 30% of that. And those are the information that should come from the scientific community, or you can actually play with the numbers if there is no, for some species, we don't have scientific information to get to that sweet spot, that level of irrigation that is right enough for each species. And then also, another part that is really important is that you need to specify what type of irrigation system you have, because controller has everything in terms of volume of water calculated or height of the water over an area. In order to calculate runtime, controller needs to know how much water the irrigation system puts. So if you program it incorrectly, then there will be over or under irrigation. This is a system that we use. I mean, we have tested multiple systems, but this is one of the systems that we use. Just an example, I'm not promoting any particular system. So this is a controller, talks to weather sensor and also flow sensor, which is really cool because if you have leaking or sprinkler that's broken, the flow sensor, actually this particular controller would notify you that there is a leak. And then also they have a dashboard that comes with subscription. I have this system in my house. I didn't get that subscription base for my house, but for my Research Plus, I have it. So if you get that, you can actually control everything using your cell phone, or there is an online app that could be used. Let's switch the gears to soil moisture-based controllers. These are, as you can tell by their name, they use soil moisture sensors to get to adjust the irrigation schedule. Unlike the weather-based controllers, they don't calculate the evapotranspiration. They are mainly they eliminate unnecessary irrigation applications. So you still need to program these controllers like traditional timers, but what they do, they just cut the water off. And I have examples that I'll show you about those. So two extreme conditions, super wet, super dry. We don't want that. And soil moisture sensors actually help us, if they program correctly, to just irrigate to get to a point that we call field capacity, that we have air, water, and soil particles, that they all are needed for healthy roots. This is another illustration. So if you saturate a pot, do this experiment, some of the water would be actually with drain, that's the gravity water drains that we consider water loss for irrigation at least purposes. To get to a point that we call field capacity, that's the capacity of the soil to hold water. So every time we irrigate, we don't want to go above that because that's a water loss. So we go to field capacity and then plants start using water. Gets drier and drier up to a point that we call it permanent wilting point. We don't want to get there either because that's the place that is dry, it's enough that plants cannot uptake any more water. They don't have the energy, and then we are going to stay between field capacity and permanent wilting point in terms of irrigation management. And soil moisture sensors can help us with that. There are two types. They either measure volumetric water content, or how much water is in the soil, volume of water, or they measure what we call soil metric potential, or energy state of the water in the soil, which is also really important parameter. Some soils, heavy soils like clay soil, they may have some water, but they hold them tight. It's hard for plants to uptake that water, so it's energy consuming for them. So the best scenario is that we have water that is available to the plants in the soil profile. So if it's all sounds super complicated, you can think about it as the basically gauge of the gas tank of your car. So soil moisture sensors help us with this. So full here would be field capacity, not saturated soil, and empty would be permanent wilting point. So we want to basically get this tank refilled when we are at a place that we call it the irrigation triggering level, okay? And that is a point that you need to program in the controllers for each soil moisture sensor that you have it installed in your lawn. This is an example of, this is an illustration of how they work actually. The controller, as I mentioned earlier, send an electric signal to the valves to open them, to the solenoid valves. And then they are open, and then you see irrigation happening. With soil moisture sensors, usually when they are wired up to the controllers, they are in between. So this is an example. Imagine that we program these soil moisture sensors at a threshold of 25%, 25% of volumetric water content, which means that if the water is higher than that, the soil moisture sensor doesn't allow irrigation to happen. If it's less than that, it's dry enough for irrigation to occur. So each time that irrigation controller sends a signal, for example, in this situation, it's the current soil moisture is 20%, it's drier than the threshold, so the sensor let the signal to pass and go through the valve, and then irrigation occurs. But in the second scenario, when actually it's wet, it's 30%. This the sensor reading. The sensor does not even let the signal to pass to the valve. So although the controller attempts to open the valves, but it's not going to happen. So you need to still have the controller program, but sometimes the sensor let the valves to be open and sometimes it doesn't. And that's all based on the threshold that is programmed. So I will be wrapping this up. I'm looking at my time soon. Another concept that is important is irrigation zoning. So we like to have, I don't know, different plants in our backyard, front yard, or even publicly maintained areas in urban settings, trees. They need different amount of water. So ideally, if we want to use an underground irrigation system and a timer and a controller, we need to do zoning, basically group them based on their water need. All right. And then if we do that with soil moisture sensor based controller, ideally we want one soil moisture sensor per zone. And for weather-based controllers, we need to know exactly how much water each zone requires, which would be, again, a fraction of that reference ET. And for some of these species, one of the objectives of my research group is that to identify how much water the plant, the landscape species, different landscape species require. So if you have a controller, a smart controller, you can actually program it easily. These are just two outreach publications that you can download from my website. One is on just understanding residential water bill. The second one is on a smart controller. We are working on the third one on, so it seems my time is up. The second one is on evapotranspiration or weather-based controllers. All the fundamentals, different types, where to get more information. This is, we try to avoid technical jargon. So hopefully it's easy enough for everybody to follow. So what are the take-home messages here? There are two types of smart controllers: weather-based, soil moisture-based. How they help us? They can help us. They can help us with adjusting irrigation amount and frequency, and that is based on the soil and plant properties and local weather conditions. Irrigation zoning is required when we have different types of plants and that they have different water needs. And then another thing that I put it in the last slide, there are rebate programs right now in Southern California. So if people are afraid or they're hesitant because they think these are expensive, the rebate programs usually cover the cost of the controllers, if not completely, most of the cost. So thank you very much. This is my website, ucrwater.com. You can get more information about everything that I discussed, publications and everything, and presentations. I will be posting them on the website as well.
Great. Thank you, Amir. I've got my old-timey clock.